Thank you very much for the introduction, Kai, and thank you to Peter Kunle for giving me this opportunity to present this work we've done recently on annealing a skyrmion lattice with spin wave excitation. So I guess in some sense this talk will bridge the gap between everything we saw with 3D type structures, skyrmionic structures yesterday, and the kind of work involving magnetics that we're seeing this afternoon. But before I go any further, let me just acknowledge the contributions of the main players who are behind this work. Titikša Srivastava, who was actually a postdoc with us, but recently got a CNRS position in our lab, so very happy about that. Gregor Lubins and Thibaut de Volder, who helped us out with VNA FMR measurements. And the samples were provided by our colleagues at the Aberfeld laboratory, just a few hundred meters from our lab. So I guess, skyrmions don't really need any introductions, but the kind of phases that we were interested in are these skyrmion lattice phases. And so, of course, this is a phase that has been known for over 10 years now, where essentially, depending on where you are on this temperature field diagram, you can have this phase that arises where you have this ordered lattice of skyrmions. And so this was seen for the first time in this iron cobalt silicon structure. And of course, since then, this type of state has been seen in other systems, of course. Ultra-thin films of cobalt, iron, boron, and MgO, for example. This is from just down the road in Mainz. And in multi-layered structures, so more complicated iridium, iron, cobalt, platinum repeats, where similar structures have been seen. And of course, the underlying principle here is that these come about from some competing interactions, usually a Zeeman field that pierces through this kind of modulated structure to form these lattices. But we wanted to look at this in a slightly different context. So we were kind of inspired by some of these ideas in fluid dynamics, in particular this two-dimensional hard disk model. So this is a very simple model of the thermodynamics of fluid systems. So you can imagine you have an ensemble of hard disks that cannot overlap. And depending on the density or the pressure of such a system, you can have different phases. So for example, a solid phase, which would organize into this hexagonal lattice here, and in some schematic illustration of the liquid phase. And of course, this is very trivial, but serves as a very interesting kind of model system to study phase transitions. So one of the early questions was, how does the solid get to the liquid phase? And so you might imagine this isotherm here. You can go through this first order phase transition where you have this two-phase coexistence. But it turns out that the picture is slightly more complicated. And due to these gentlemen here, Kosteles, Dulitz, Halpern, Nelson, and Young, they propose that, in fact, when you melt this solid, it goes through this hexatic phase indicated here. And so what does this hexatic phase represent? So it is a state in which you maintain the short-range translational order of a liquid, but you keep the long-range orientational order of the solid phase. Okay? So you have a mixture between these two. And intrinsically, this melting is mediated by topological defects. So by that I mean defects in the lattice structure itself, not skyrmions or anything like that. So these can be dislocations and disclinations. And typically what we see a lot in these dislocations is that whereas here each site has 6 nearest neighbors, dislocations are dominated by these 7 defects where one site has 5 nearest neighbors and its neighboring site has 7 nearest neighbors. And so we thought, skyrmion lattices might be an interesting system to explore that. And indeed, this is, we weren't the only ones to think of this. So this is an example of a fairly recent experimental study where they studied just this, the melting of a skyrmion lattice to a skyrmion liquid via this hexatic phase. So this is in this copper selenium oxide material where you can see here as a function of increasing field. So this is Lorentz TM images, this very ordered skyrmion lattice structure that begins to melt. And on top here is this Voronoi tessellation construction where you just basically pull out where the positions of all these skyrmion cores are. And these little colored kind of cells that you see are precisely these defects that I talked about on the previous slide. And so if you plot the number of these defects as a function of applied field, which takes you from the solid phase to this liquid or hexatic phase, you can see that the number of defects increases as predicted by theory. And so, okay, but we're dynamics people, so so we wanted, well, these lattices also have some interesting resonances. So again, this has been studied a long time ago, where it was shown that you could have these collective counterclockwise or clockwise gyration modes within this lattice structure. And more recently, groups in Singapore showed that in these metallic multilayers, which are infinitely more complex, they can harbor also some high frequency modes, which involve either excitations of the skyrmions themselves or excitations of the background in which these skyrmions live. So we wondered, what would these resonances do to this ordering of these lattices in such systems? And so the system that we studied is the following. So this is following on the route of what Vincent Cross presented yesterday. These multi-layered structures of platinum, iron, cobalt, boron, aluminum oxide, so 20-layer repeats, where the ferromagnetic material is 1.2 nanometers thick. The platinum provides the DMI. And what is interesting to note here is that because we have this oxide layer that separates the ferromagnet from the next platinum layer, in principle, we don't have any kind of RKKY coupling. So these are purely dipolar coupled layers in this ferromagnetic stack. And what is interesting for the dynamics point of view is that the Gilbert damping has been measured to be down to 0.02, which is pretty good for these kinds of platinum-based multi-layered systems. And so this is an example of the magnetization curve of one of these multi-layered stacks. So this is a perpendicular magnetic field. So you can see that it's quite smooth. So the overall anisotropy is quite weak. And as we sweep through these curves, we can see a variety of different domain structures, labyrinthine domains, mixed states between worm domains and skyrmions, and at 0.6 over here, just before we get to saturation, we recover something that looks a bit like a skyrmion lattice. So this is the kind of phase that we're interested in. And so we tried to model this through micromagnetics. So this is the kind of thing that I do. What we found to be very important was to model the full 20-layer repeat, because the dipolar interactions are quite important in such systems. Other groups have used effective medium theories to try to model what's going on, but we did the full stack with a number of different discretization schemes that I won't bore you with the details. Okay, so how do our simulations compare to experiments? So here's a comparison between what we measured experimentally and what we get from simulation. And so you can see from the magnetization curves, we have pretty much quantitative agreement. And on top here, we just show snapshots of the domain structures, so we can really capture this transition from the fully field polarized state through the creation of labyrinthine domains, mixed states, and the skyrmion lattice, and so on. And we also find pretty good agreement for the skyrmion density. So these are the curves shown on the bottom here, the red indicating how this density varies as a function of this perpendicular applied field. And quite notably, we reproduce this plateau here in the density, which corresponds to this skyrmion lattice state. So this is also something that we see in experiment. And now, so we have a close look at what's going on in this lattice phase. So here is a cut, a three-dimensional cross-section of just a corner of the simulation. And so you see, like we saw yesterday, the behavior in the thickness direction can be quite complex. So you can see that black is the core of the skyrmion, but you can see that surrounding this core, the magnetization actually assumes a very complex structure, and it can vary from one skyrmion to the next. So this shows you the importance of dipolar interactions that are in competition with the DMI. And if we have a look at this, in some detail, so if we just pick one of these skyrmions here and plot out the three-dimensional structure, we see these kind of long cigar-shaped objects. And you'll note that half of the structure is mainly topological, but the top half is not. Okay, so this is a result of competing DMI and dipolar interactions. And you can see this if you do a layer-resolved kind of topological charge count. On the bottom, you have something like 20 per square micron. And as you go onto the top half, this kind of number goes down and it fluctuates a little. And this seems to be a general feature of these material systems. So now we wanted to look at the dynamics of this. So experimentally, so Thibault performed these vector network analyzer FMR measurements where we put the samples on a coplanar waveguide, apply RF fields in the plane of the film, and look at the susceptibility response in some sense. Okay. And so this is the map of the susceptibility. So this is the color scale tells you the response. So basically, you have to look at these black and white curves here. So these don't indicate different modes, but it's just a differential measurements. We look at derivatives to eke out the very small signal. But essentially, we see a number of features which are correlated with the different domain states. So for example, Km corresponds to the Kittel mode, something that we only see when the film is fully saturated. Different families of high frequency, intermediate, and low frequency modes, shown here by the different arrows. And so we spend a lot of time trying to understand what these different branches correspond to. So if we compare to what we did in simulations, we can see that the results are shown on the left. We managed to reproduce all the features practically quantitatively. And if we just overlay the experimental data and the simulations, I think you'll agree that we did a fairly decent job in getting this. I mean, what do you think? Because one of the referees that rejected our paper for NatureCom said that the agreement was not good enough. So I don't know. I don't know what else. What else? Drawing blood from from stone. Anyway, so we're confident we know what's going on. I mean, that's the main message here. Okay, so let's look at this. Let's look at the response at this particular field, 300 millitesla, in the skyrmion lattice phase. So on the top here is this imaginary part of the susceptibility that we calculated. Okay, so you can see all these different peaks, the low frequency modes, intermediate, and the high frequency modes, which is much higher up in frequency. Okay. So I won't talk about the low frequency mode here, just focus on the intermediate. So the intermediate, you'll notice that there are a couple of peaks, okay? And what I show in this representation, it might look a bit confronting initially. So it's a three-dimensional representation of our skyrmion lattice. And the color code works such that dark blue represents regions where the magnetization responds perfectly in quadrature with our RF field. Okay, so this is the pure susceptibility response of the 90-degree out-of-phase response. So we know that something is resonating really at this frequency. And red just happens to be something that is dephased by pi. So basically what this tells you is that the density of the blue is more or less spread out across the whole volume of this material. And if we just take cross-sections here where these dashed lines are, okay, you can see that the regions where it is the darkest in blue corresponds to regions between the different skyrmions. Okay, so the skyrmions are shown in circles here. What does that tell you? It tells you that the IFM corresponds to domain resonances in some sense of the background magnetization, while not a lot is going on at the skyrmions themselves. Okay. But when we look at the high frequency mode, so high frequency is about 15 gigahertz here, we see cigar-like structures. Okay. If we take the same cut, we'll notice now that the dark regions are localized within the cores themselves. Okay. So this high frequency mode corresponds to the case where the cores are processing in phase with the RF field that we're applying. Because these little pockets of reverse magnetization which are processing in phase with our RF field. Okay. And if we look more closely at this picture, okay, so this is a zoom of the picture here, you'll notice waves between the different skyrmion cores. Okay. So what's happening is that we're driving with this uniform RF field. It's a uniform RF field that we're applying. Okay. We're getting these cores to process in unison, and these cores are emitting spin waves that now flow into the ferromagnetic background. Okay. So these are, you see these different, blue-red kind of contrast that you see everywhere. Okay. It's not a very uniform kind of emission, but given the kind of structures that we have here, it's perhaps not so surprising. So if we take this line, we do a line cut across here, and we look at how this response looks like in the thickness. So you can see here are 5 skyrmions. And so you'll note that, again, at the cores of these skyrmions, it's a dark blue color, which means this is what's really responding to the RF field that's being applied. And fairly coherent wavefronts being emitted between the skyrmions. Okay? So we're quite confident that what we're driving here, skyrmion core precession leading to spin wave emission. And what is kind of interesting is that I've reproduced this cutout of this 3-dimensional skyrmionic texture, where I showed you before that mostly topological below, not so topological above, but it doesn't seem like it plays a large role in this spin wave emission picture, where we can see that it works just as well below than it does above. Okay. And so if you take a Fourier transform now of just this image here, you can get an idea of what the wave vector is. So we see, so this is a Fourier transform. The dots basically correspond to the periodicity of the skyrmion lattice, but you'll see that there's this weak halo out around here, and this is basically gives you the effective wave vector of spin waves that are being generated by this high frequency mode. Okay. And it turns out that it's not really limited to this particular frequency, so this is a broadband generation process. We can sweep the frequency across this range shown here, and okay, well, it does respond more or less well when we get into this range here, but as the Fourier transform shows on the bottom, we can generate, in effect, selectively what kind of wave vectors are being emitted by these precessing skyrmion cores. So there you go, that's the connection to the 3D magnonics through the skyrmions. But okay, let's come back to our problem of the lattice. So when we were doing these simulations, there were instances in which, okay, we found these states. So this is an example out of the simulation. So at a particular applied field, and there are some kind of skyrmions missing. Okay, but that's kind of normal because you know, as you keep increasing the field, this lattice will eventually disappear. And we noticed that after we applied the RF excitation, that kind of hole was kind of filled up. Right? So that's interesting. Could the spin waves actually be ordering the lattice somehow? Right? So here, I mean, visually, there's not much you can kind of distinguish between the initial and the final states, perhaps apart from this. And if you look at the Fourier transform of this lattice, well, it's more or less retained its hexagonal character. If you pick a different field where initially the state is slightly more disordered, okay, it's an array, but it's not really a hexagonal lattice. After the application of the applied spin waves, I don't know, maybe it's subjective, but it does look at slightly more ordered. And if you look at the Fourier analysis before and after, you might be able to kind of pick out the points a bit sharper on this side. So we have ordered the system somewhat. Okay. And so you can analyze this quantitatively using what is called an orientational order parameter. So this is given by this thing called psi6, where you basically have this phase factor e to the I6 theta ij, where theta ij basically corresponds to this angle between neighboring bonds, okay, based on some reference direction. That's not really important what that is. And if you kind of construct this quantity, then that gives you some measure of what the orientational order is in your system. And the argument, what is interesting is that the argument of this order is akin to like a domain orientation in some sense. Okay, it's like an orientation of these local domains. So the point being that initially we find a system that is more or less disordered in terms of orientation, but after the application of these RF signals, we have improved somewhat the domain structure in some sense in this skyrmion lattice. Okay, and we can also analyze the improvement in terms of these 5-7 defects I spoke of earlier on. So here again is a Voronoi construction of the skyrmion lattice, where shown in orange and blue are these defects where one has only 5 nearest neighbors, the blue has 7 nearest neighbors. Okay, there's some yellow squares which correspond to other numbers. But basically, they give you an idea of where the defects are. And again, after the application of this RF field generating spin waves, we see that we have ordered the lattice somewhat by reducing the number of defects in the system. Okay. And okay, you can see how this varies as a function of time. So here is an example of what I just showed you. With an RF field of 0.1 millitesla, you can drive this a bit stronger. It doesn't always lead to a better result in terms of ordering. So I think this is related to how the spin waves really interact with the cores. But nevertheless, I mean, it does not beat thermal annealing in some sense. So if you run the system and you just, over microseconds at finite temperatures, this does a much better job of actually annealing a system. But we thought this was kind of a neat example of how just using spin wave excitations, you can reorder a skyrmion lattice. And so just the last example I want to show you, it's not limited to these high frequency spin waves. So if you excite one of these intermediate frequency modes, which were these domain resonances, it also does the job quite well. So it's the same story. Start with a disordered state, and you end up with a slightly less disordered state. So this is something that we want to explore a little more in the future. So again, here, you need to drive the system with much higher RF fields, but we get to levels which are very close to what we see from thermal annealing of the skyrmion lattice. Okay, so with that, let me just come to the summary slide. So we studied these three-dimensional skyrmionic textures and these platinum, iron, cobalt, boron multi-layered structures. So I showed you that there are these particular modes where if we drive it in the tens of gigahertz range, we can generate spin waves. And we think that the interaction between these generated spin waves and the cores themselves can lead to ordering of these skyrmion lattices. So with that, let me thank you for your attention.